Lior will discuss the strategic Israeli approach to cyber power through the application of soft and hard power instruments. Lior is a scholar of cyber power at the Tel Aviv University Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center and the director of cyber strategy with the consultancy firm of CSG. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for a kind introduction. The ideas I will be presenting now, I have developed them in Tel Aviv University. I come from political science, from international relations and security studies scholarship. And now I am part of the newly established Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center, which brings together about 250 people in the university from different perspectives. Part of the work that we do, as you can see, as I represent, is social science. Now, I personally love hacking. This is how I got here in the first place. I was doing IT security, IT administration, because I love hacking. I like it. It's usually a beautiful thing, but it creates risks, as we all know. That's why we are here. To mitigate these risks, we usually, at least from my experience, turn to seek more IT professionals, harder cryptography, better coding. Now a new thing, relatively new thing, is bigger and fatter cyber commands, counting heads of cyber warriors, and so on. We have been at it for decades now. This is not the earliest example, but this is from the 70s, from 1970, the American Defense Science Board, which basically outlines all the vulnerabilities that we have going on today. The result is insecurity. It's actually very convenient to use the American example because they publish things unlike others. But this is, I think, the situation that we will all agree that security has not improved much. I try to explain why in my research, and I'll present part of it here. For that, I'll outline an analytical framework that I try to develop now, and I presented partly in the paper, framework of understanding cyber power. And afterwards, I applied to analyze the Israeli experience. Power, by definition, only manifests when it is applied in a conflict, usually, to achieve certain ends. Power is relational, as Dr. Stevens reminded us yesterday, told us the panel. And cyber power is no different in that principle. To create power, one needs strategy. Strategy, the best definition that I found is from a recent book by Lawrence Friedman, is the art of creating power. And the essence of strategy remains to find the correct relations between the ends that someone has to define and the ways and means that you use to achieve these ends. This is the sort of the theoretical part. And looking at our practice of cybersecurity, we too often focus on what here is marked in the red, on the tactics and the technology, which are important, but they only get us this far. Throughout history, going back to the bodies of knowledge that exist in research, throughout history, superior means were never enough to succeed, to achieve a strategic success. You can win a battle here and there, but you cannot prevail. And I want to shift the focus on the higher level of strategy, the grand strategy of correlating better between the ends and the means. Now I turn to analyze strategy and power in action. This is the maps of Sykes-Picot from about a century ago. It was a pretty bad mess then. It's not much better today. And under this background, the ideology that driven the creation of Israel establishment has pretty much remained the same. The ends are very much high level, establish, secure, and develop the state. And this is, for that, there was a strategy outlined. Some progress have been made, but importantly, the ends remain the same. If you ask anyone today that deals with security in Israel, they do fear for the very security in the state in the most direct sense. So the ends developed, the ends remain the same. The strategy to make the progress is a subject of much debate that is going on in the literature. It's probably underdeveloped now. This slide is taken from my book from last year, Cybersecurity in Israel, that I wrote together with Professor Ben Israel. This is a basic illustration of the grand strategy. You have the constraints, you have the goal, and you work out some strategic principles to not often articulate them, but one of them is to look for quality, because there is no way you can match the quantity of the land, the population, and so on. This principle has, I think it succeeded, and it is the same principle that we need to look for in cyber power. To secure the state, Israel continuously opts for qualitative advantage, and this is, as you understand, the major threat for the Israeli politicians in the last couple of decades. You can also go here to the idea of doom scenario, cyber doom and threat inflation, but the fact is that this is the major threat. So it is, should be relatively straightforward to argue that the same strategy guides the response to the major threat. You go out, you look for the best ways to achieve qualitative advantage, develop sophisticated, precision-guided cyber technology, and use it as a weapon to achieve the most important ends. This is, regardless of the effectiveness of such results, this shows the correlation between the ends, what you want to achieve, and the means, what you choose to do. Stuxnet was a manifestation of hard power and cyber power, but soft power is no less important, and in the recent couple of decades, information technology in general and cyber security in particular has been driving much of the economic growth, which is part of the cyber power, and other benefits that come with it. For example, cybersecurity, as we all know, is mostly a civilian issue rather than military, because we need to protect the whole society and not the military hardware usually. And in that case, in that context, you have very much importance of what's going on the civilian side of things. And the industry is developing really well, and it's also being deployed. For example, I think it's good to mention that since 2003, Israel has an arrangement for oversight of critical infrastructure protection, which is all civilian. It has nothing to do with the defense sector, that actually forces them to deploy all sorts of best practices to defend themselves. Because when in the 90s, let's say, the Israeli defense forces were looking at electronic warfare, information warfare, were all very excited about it. Then someone thought about it and realized that the only country in the region that can suffer from this thing is Israel itself. So there was a concerted effort to implement critical infrastructure protection in the civilian sector, which also drove much of the industry that we are seeing today. So to summarize, the main results of the analysis of this framework is to see that, to show that Israel exercises cyber technology for soft and hard power across the instruments of power. The military instrument of power is probably clear enough to apply it against the primary threat. In the couple of last years, the defense exports in Israel, which has always been high, are now second to the cyber exports. Cyber technology exports to the security, usually not to the government, to the civilian sector, it's not including government-to-government deals, are larger than the defense exports, which drives much of the economic growth. And according to Gartner estimates, the Israeli companies take about 8% of the global market. And as you know, which is far above the weight of this. So this is another result. It is another manifestation of potential for soft power, which mostly manifests in international cooperation that we see continuously both in the university and in government related things, and in business investments that pretty much every company that deals with cybersecurity has an R&D operation in Israel. These are not, so to recap, this may sound a bit like a promo for Israel. This is not. This is an analytical framework that I'm trying to develop, and I want to use the case to illustrate its usefulness. The key takeaway is why do you think, or do many people think, that Israel has cyber power? This is not about counting the exports or counting the attacks that someone carried out, not about counting the number of graduates in STEM and so on. This is about the ends, ways, means nexus, how things correlate and how they are driven by this some sort of overarching goal. To succeed in this realm of cyber power and cybersecurity, first of all, to succeed in cybersecurity, we need cyber power. The minimum thing is to protect the things that we already have. I think the appropriate thing that most will agree on is to be able to use cyber technology to achieve the goals that you have across the domains, across the instruments of power, regardless of what these goals may be. Most of them have to do with not with the military goals, but economic, social, and other stuff that the state has to provide its citizens. And this is the proper context of cyber power that I'm trying to advocate. I have, in this particular research, I have only used strategic studies and some of the economic literature on national innovation systems, how the state can facilitate better cooperation across the sectors of the society, something that's called the ecosystem of innovation. But this framework is open for much more different inputs from different disciplines. Our center at Tel Aviv University welcomes interdisciplinary research and international cooperation, and I hope that we will continue to progress in this important area of cybersecurity along with like-minded countries. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh. Thank you to the three presenters. That concludes the presentations. So now we go to the debating and question and answer part. And as moderator, I reserve the right to ask the first question. That's all. It's actually the same question for both Sean and Steve, but from your own different perspectives. In the terrorist use of cyber capabilities and in the use of cyber terminologies by politicians in the US, how much of it is just basic opportunism, and how much is actually strategy? How much is it really deciding, pre-thought out use of cyber Armageddon terms, and not like Robert Wark, who recently said we are dropping cyber bombs. It's kind of like, well, it sounds good, so I'll use it, and not really knowing what the hell it actually means, what he's talking about. So how much is opportunistic and how much is real strategy?
Right. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can do the terrorism side. So how much is actual strategy versus opportunism? We have, I believe we pretty much, the terrorism studies have gotten to the point where we say the use of cyber by terrorists in terms of propaganda, exploitation, if you will, the propaganda, recruiting, command and control, has pretty much been determined to be one of the strategies that they use to either widen their grip or to evade law enforcement measures. In terms of the actual use of cyber attack, thus far, one of the things about terrorist organizations is that they're not necessarily very innovative. They are very conservative when it comes to tactics that they use. They like to go back to what they know. They like security. They like things to go boom when they actually press the button. So cyber is one of those things that is an unknown. They haven't used it before a lot. So they are not an innovator, rather than they're more of a, they take what other people have done, so they look at other people who have done it and say, oh, look, that seems to have an effect. Let's try it out and see what happens. Perhaps that's why ISIL is the one prevalent organization, because it is currently the largest and primarily well-funded organization that's out there. So in terms of attacks and things like that, we think is primarily more opportunistic at this moment, and then the rest of it, use of internet for publications and things like that, are more of a strategy.
Yeah, so in terms of the messaging component of this, I'm not entirely sure, what the proportion is between folks who use sort of over-the-top rhetoric consciously as a strategy, like they're actually thinking to themselves, okay, I'm going to frame it this way, and if I really scare people, then they're going to take me seriously, or they're going to support the policy proposals I'm pushing, or something like this. Or if it, on the other hand, what percentage of folks who use that rhetoric are just sort of doing it off the cuff, or they're not really thinking very consciously, about using that rhetoric. But I think part of, what we can learn from the work that we've done in our paper is it kind of really doesn't matter if they're doing it consciously or not. These kinds of messages, these kinds of constructions can still have detrimental effects. Right? It's really not dependent on the intent of the person who was using it. So I would say one lesson that we could learn from this is, if you're the type of person who sort of throws around the cyber doom, willy-nilly without thinking about it, maybe be a little more conscious about what you're saying when you're communicating to policymakers or the media or wider public audiences, because the use of this kind of rhetoric can potentially backfire. It might not be getting you the results that you perhaps want to be getting. And if, there are folks who are consciously trying to ramp up the fear because they think that that is a good strategy, the lesson might be that not really, or at least some caveats which say fear can work, but it has to be part of a very clearly defined messaging strategy. Where you have to understand what the components are, and they have to be balanced. And I think there's really a need for more research in this area of trying to figure out, what is the most effective way to communicate about cybersecurity issues to wider publics and get them interested and involved in taking some kind of an action. Because, as Steve was saying, a lot of times, the issues that maybe make a lot of us afraid, right? We see issues of espionage and theft and the potential for physical attack, kinetic effects through cyber, although we haven't seen a lot of that in the real world, but the effect, the potentials are definitely there. And that scares a lot of us in this room, right? Because we understand those things. But to this point, cyber attacks have sort of lacked that dramatic effect that Steve's talking about from traditional terrorism. So in that case, we're faced with the dilemma of, how do we communicate this threat to policymakers, to the media, and to wider publics in a way that is effective in getting their attention, raising awareness, and motivating people to act, but doesn't rely so much on fear that it motivates people to do the wrong thing, or it completely turns them off and causes them to put their heads in the sand and ignore what we're saying. So I think there's a real balancing act. Whether people are using this rhetoric intentionally or not, there's a balancing act we got to find.
And Lior, this balancing act for Israel, which of course always has this sense of urgency, this existential threat perception or reality, does that impact the way you communicate, the government communicates about the cyber threat?
I think sometimes they would like to use it intentionally, but perhaps unluckily, cyber threat is not among the top issues on the security agenda, so it takes a much less prominent position on the public debate regarding security. So it's basically nuclear power, diplomatic relations with the rest of the world, and terrorism.
Okay, thank you. Well, now the floor, please. Anyone has a question? There are microphones coming up. Everyone. Oh, first we'll go back. Yeah.
Thank you. Daniel Moore, King's College London, and VeriSign iDefense. This is a question for Steve. So we see on a daily basis hundreds of attacks that are affiliated rather loosely with collectives of hacktivists that self-identify as being a part of a violent extremist group online. This could be the so-called cyber caliphate, or it could be the Saudi offshoot of Anonymous. But this is usually constricted to defacement style events. And I'm wondering if you do incorporate those kind of events into your scope and call those attacks, doesn't it muddle a bit the discourse that you have on it? And if so, what is the threshold of attack as you see it for your own research?
Okay, I'll give it a go. So we in our research we did include defacements and such of that nature as a threshold. So basically, anything above actually what we normally know as cyber attacks, like defacement of websites, DDoS attacks. So we have incorporated all that into our attack model. The one thing that we were trying to do in our collection phase to discern whether an attack was actually by or on behalf of organization was a little bit more difficult, because there are a lot of attacks that somebody will do it and say, oh, we did it because we support ISIL. But they actually, if you do some digging, they actually have no real connection to ISIL in any way, shape, or form. So there was some of that difficulty that we did. So once we were pretty confident that we could delineate, yes, this organization conducted the attack on behalf, in either as a direction from ISIL or whatever organization we were looking at, or because they are actually affiliated as part of that organization, the numbers were still pretty low. If we actually, Reiner, if we included the attacks that were claimed to be because we're supporting the electronic jihad, for example, for openly just saying it, then we actually did not include those in our data set because we could not attribute that to any actual organization.
Thank you. Another question there.
Thank you. Kristen Stoddart, Aberystwyth University. I'm also a social scientist and IR person. I'm also part of a project team, which I described yesterday at another panel. We look at CNI, critical national infrastructure, particularly SCADA systems, industrial control systems as an attack vector. I work with 2 members from industry, which is Airbus, and 5 computer scientists. So it's a fairly large project. And we've been doing it for quite a while, and I go to a lot of industry conferences, and what we tend to find is problems and problem areas, multiple attack vectors, major question marks against infrastructure and protection of infrastructure, and that ranges from physical hardware through to people, the low-hanging fruit, people always being the weak link. And I'm afraid to say, I think the cyber doom scenario, which you're skeptical about, I think it's a little bit, I don't think we can dismiss it. And I'd be careful of that. But at the same time, I'm slightly agreeing with you because I think the level of policy debate has not been great, and it still isn't great. I think the awareness is lacking for whatever reason. I think partly because computer science doesn't always translate itself well to policymakers. And that translation process is something we can help with, I hope anyway. I don't really have a question besides that, except to say, our team worries about threats all the way through from terrorists and lone wolves, all the way through to major state-based events. And I think across that spectrum, there are dangers, possibilities, worries, concerns. I'd like to think that the cyber doom scenarios are unrealistic. I'm not so sure. I'm just not so sure.
Yeah. So a couple of responses to that. So the first is to say, you know, I'm not the only one, and even James Clapper is not the only one to sort of try to put the brakes on the doom rhetoric. In fact, I did a paper several years ago for another publication, an engineering publication, actually, on an industrial control system, cybersecurity. I'm not entirely sure why they asked me to write for that particular book, but what I looked at was sort of official assessments of the threat over time and the degree to which critical infrastructure figured prominently or not in official US assessments. And actually, was surprised to find that when you look at like major policy speeches and major strategy documents, et cetera, critical infrastructure does not show up as much as you would expect in U.S. policy documents. And you get statements as far back as 2008 with the big report from CSIS basically saying, we used to think the threat was critical infrastructure, dams, opening, stuff exploding, but now we know it's really informational, it's theft of information, right? So a lot of people have been saying this, and critical infrastructure has sort of fallen off, at least during the Obama administration, as one of the major concerns in the key policy documents when you go and you sort of code them for what is the target of the threat that you guys were talking about, right? What do we perceive to be the target of the threat? But even beyond that, whether or not that assessment is correct or not, right, I'm still interested in the effect that hyperbolic rhetoric can have, right? Because the rhetoric can have effects independent of whether or not it's correct or not, right? And so even if the threat might really be cyber doom, what the social science research on fear appeal messaging tells us is, even if it's a real threat, if you communicate it in the wrong way, you can still have counterproductive results, right? So at some level, it doesn't even really matter whether it's the real threat or not, because the way you communicate it can still have negative impacts.
And actually, to follow up on that a little bit, it's a little bit of a different example. But so the radiological and nuclear terrorism cases, we have the U.S. government has had the exact same problem. Radiological and nuclear terrorism, very high consequence event, but extremely low probability. But usually, what happens is you go to either the local or the state responders, and you say, how are you preparing for eventuality this may happen? Usually the response is, oh, I'm not going to deal with it, we're all dead. Well, that is not productive. So I think there's a point there. In the cyber world, we can't get there. I mean, the US government has spent a lot of money and a lot of effort to reverse that trend so that the state and local can go, oh, there are some things we can do to prepare our citizens and ourselves for this. So I think cyber world can't actually follow the RN model. We should avoid an RM model and actually go forward in a productive manner.
Yes, here front.
Rob Walker, U.S. Department of Energy. Lior, I'm going to direct this to you at first because I think Israel is kind of in a unique position here. It has a very high concentration of the population within its borders, and you guys have an incredibly high participation in the defense forces. Does Israel currently conduct, or does it plan to in the future, any kind of exercises or drills? Should there be a major doomsday scenario cyber attack? Let's restrict it to communication infrastructure. Do the Israeli security forces know where to go and prepare for a physical attack in conjunction with, or how to show up to work should communications blackout occur at some point?
Okay, so the short answer is yes. The long answer is much more complicated because of the substantial ethical and moral issue of involving the defense forces in the protection of the civilian critical infrastructure. This has been and remains one of the issues that I think stifles cybersecurity everywhere. The defense forces have a lot of capability, and if something major happens, they will have to do something. But in practice, it is not their responsibility, and they don't have access. For that, you have since 2003, you have an authority that guides, which is a nice word to say, forces, utilities to do things that this authority tells them to do, to buy stuff, to train people, to have resilience and so on. And actually, it has been going since 2003, but in 2011 strategy, it was deemed not enough, because this authority is placed in the Shabak, in the Israeli Security Agency, the internal service, which presents another ethical and political issue of having intelligence services sitting inside the networks of critical infrastructure, including the financial sector. The financial sector is not under their supervision. And now there is a transition of this authority to a new agency. And I think we all know how these things work when you transition something from one agency to another. It remains to be seen. But I would say the focus of the policy is now looking beyond the critical infrastructure, because this is sort of regulated. We sort of know who is responsible for what. It's a joint responsibility of the operators, the private sector, and the authorities. But because of the development of technology, there's so much interconnectedness going on that the focus of the policy is to seek a national comprehensive resilience, so to speak. So it's no longer the focal point of the efforts. It's kind of a second order problem now, because we've been dealing this for quite a few years now.
For the American gentleman, do you foresee any policy initiatives in the near future for the United States government, and especially agencies that are in charge of responding to this type of disaster or attack, making any kind of, even from messaging to a concerted plan to a national level exercise?
I wouldn't expect anything big to happen in the next, year or two. I mean, with the election coming up, right, everything comes to a stop and nothing happens. So yeah, I don't see anything happening big on that front. I mean, it took how many years to get CISA, right, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing and Awareness Act passed, and it's pretty weak in terms of like what it really does, right? So. And it took a long time, and it only got passed because so much of any sort of teeth were cut out of it in terms of any kind of like regulations or standards or for industry or anything like that. So, and the current political climate, I don't see anything happening soon. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. Especially in terms of the threat side of things, we tend to look at the next brightest light. Currently, the ISIL has that spot. If we're going to have any policy comes out, that's more than likely going to be geared towards countering that particular threat rather than threat as a holistic whole. So, and given our political season that we're in, it's probably nothing substantial is going to happen in the near future.
I think we have time for one more question over there. It's on the other side.
Namık Kaplan, Turkish Armed Forces. Yeah, my question may be to Steve, but any member, panel member can answer. So I like your work, public, private, and academic. So concerns, if you combine three of them, so it makes the national security concerns. So my question would be national security point of view. So Syrian Electronic Army executes cyber attacks to Turkey. And besides that, we receive legacy, mortars, shells coming from Syria to Turkey. So that's, cyber war with the kinetic war. So you haven't touched in your work, but how do you define the relation between two? Can you elaborate on that? Thank you.
Okay. So our center, actually, this is where I fall back onto our center's charter as an excuse. But our center was actually chartered to look at non-state actors specifically. So in this particular work, we collected data on Syrian Electronic Army's activities. But if they conducted cyber warfare against Turkey, for example, on behalf of the government of Syria, that is not included in our set. So we have the information, but that's not used in the research. So that's one of the things that we do, is that so state-to-state activities are not something that we look at normally unless there is a need, or during the research, there may be some need for us to look at state-to-state activities because they do it through a proxy such as Syrian Electronic Army. So if that is the case, then we may look at it, but for this particular data set, those are not included in the data set itself, but we do have the information for those.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think with that we can conclude this session, and with this diverse lot of presentation. I think we came up with a coherent session, so thank you very much for that. That leaves me to hand you over our present, and as you all have to go to the necessary security checks, rest assured there are no hemp seats in there, so this should be all very safe. Again,
Yeah.
thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.